What other threats do we get to democracy from militarism? Well, first of all, militarism tends to expand government surveillance of its citizens. We have seen peace people put on terrorist lists, such as the no-fly list, and we have seen that the Federal Bureau of Investigation has gone in to peace organizations just like Oregon Peaceworks and arrested the peace activists and impounded their equipment. Furthermore, we've seen that organizations like the Central Intelligence Agency has conducted secret, illegal actions, destroying the rule of law. They've taken people prisoner, they've killed people, and another organization that's done that has been the Delta Force. These are the kinds of things that we see happening increasingly when we turn to the military as the main way that we express ourselves in the world. In fact, James Madison told us way back at the beginning of our country, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is the most to be dreaded because it comprises the germ of every other. No nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. And yet, continual warfare seems to be pretty much what we have now. Here are a few other costs that we pay. Indeed, President Dwight Eisenhower, Republican president in the 1950s, said this at the end of his period in office: "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fires signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the clouds of war, it is humanity hanging on a cross of iron." Now we might ask ourselves, yes, okay, I'm convinced that we're spending too much money on the Pentagon, on the military, but can we cut the Pentagon? The Defense Department budget since World War II is very instructive to look at. As you see, after World War II in 1945, the military spending began to really seriously drop off. And it went way down, and this incidentally had been typical of the military budget after every war that the United States had fought up to World War II. So the spending went down and then began to climb a little bit as we got into the Cold War. There's a little bump there that you see, which was the Korean War in 1953. Then it dropped off again, although not as much as we might have hoped, because the Cold War kept it high through the 60s. But going into the end of the 60s, we see that the Vietnam War began to take the spending back up again, and that it went up through the period of the Vietnam War and then dropped off again, although once again not down as far as it did after World War II. But then during the Reagan years, beginning in 1980, military spending began to rise again, and please note that during those Reagan years, it went higher than it did even during the peak of the Vietnam War or the Korean War. Then after the Reagan years and the first Bush years, during the first Bush years, it dropped off a little bit again, peaked again a little bit there when we went into Iraq the first time, and then when we went into Iraq the second time, you see that blue line taking off, and you see that the war spending began to incredibly increase. You can see what would have happened if we kept spending the way we were. I mean, we were continuing to spend more and more, but the war funding really took the money up at that point. Barney Frank, who's a congressman, and Ron Paul both made a proposal, and this is a strong Democrat and a strong Republican made a proposal together that would cut about $1 trillion over 10 years. They said, let's cut nuclear warheads, let's reduce the size of the military forces, and let's cut certain weapon systems that we don't really need. That proposal was one way we could cut. Here's some examples of the things that we could cut that would not reduce the strength of the United States in any way. First of all, we could end the war in Afghanistan, which most Americans don't favor anymore. And we could not start any new wars. Another thing we could do is reduce the network of overseas U.S. military bases. We looked at all those military bases. Do we really need 1,000 bases in other parts of the world? We can eliminate programs that are obsolete and wasteful, including nuclear weapons, and we can stop outsourcing war. Those are 4 very simple steps that we could take to cut the military budget that would not in any way reduce the strength of the United States or our ability to defend ourselves if we needed to. Right now, we have the mechanism of sequestration, which is supposed to reduce the budget by a certain amount all the way across the board. There is a myth that sequestration would devastate the military. If it were to go into effect, the most that would be cut would bring the Pentagon back to 2007 spending levels, which were not, after all, particularly low. They were much higher than we found necessary after World War II, when the big financial boom was beginning to happen in the United States. If the Pentagon sustained the maximum possible cuts under the sequestration idea, we'd still account for 40% of the world's military spending. Isn't that enough? So we can see that we actually have a choice. We can have militarism, or we can have a peace economy and the civil liberties that we have come to treasure. So what could we do with some of those Pentagon dollars if we weren't spending them on the military? Here's a picture that applies to Maryland, but it applies equally well to Oregon and to many other states as well. You see that the tuition costs of 4-year colleges and 2-year colleges are rising steadily. We could defray some of those college costs because an educated citizenry provides security probably a lot better than the military does in today's world. Another thing we could do, we could ensure health care coverage for every person in the United States, not just every Marylander, but every Oregonian and everybody else, every American. In Maryland, 133,000 children live in poverty. Libraries have been decimated. School classes increased. Services for kids cut. 44% of roads and 25% of bridges need repair. There are a lot of people with developmental disabilities, and public health services are being drastically cut. That's not true just in Maryland, that's true everywhere. These are the kinds of things that we could fund if we were not spending more than the whole rest of the world put together on our military. Here in Oregon, let's take a look at what we could do. In Oregon here, we paid $5 billion toward the Pentagon budget in fiscal year 2012. $5 billion is a pretty huge amount of money for the state of Oregon. The entire state fiscal year 2011 to 2013 budget for our state, which is done on a biennium, is $14.7 billion. What that means is $7.35 billion a year. So contrast that $5 billion that we sent to the Pentagon with that total cost of running our state. It's a very substantial amount. The shortfall that we had in those $14.7 billion in that biennium was $3.5 billion. In 1 year, we could have more than covered that shortfall, had plenty of money left over with 1 year's Pentagon spending from Oregon residents alone. So it's pretty important to the state of Oregon that we not spend so much on the military. It's also important, I think, to realize that the Pentagon is not necessarily doing us any big favors most of the time. Here's what decorated Marine General Smedley Butler wrote in 1935 as he realized, looking back on his career, what the net effect of his career had been. He said, "I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism." Now, we're not talking about a person who didn't know what he was talking about. We're talking about a decorated Marine general saying this. And he realized way back in 1935 that this was not a good way for him to have used his career. And the same is true just as much, if not more so, today. So let's come to some conclusions about this. Military spending at current levels is not beneficial to the U.S. public, it's not beneficial to the U.S. economy, or to U.S. freedoms, or to world stability, or to the state of Oregon, or to the environment, or to our spiritual well-being. So the question that we have to consider is, what are we going to do about it? And that's the question I would urge you to talk over with your friends, with your relatives, with your groups that you're a member of, and to think over very deeply yourself. I want to thank you very much for having been a member of the audience for this presentation. I appreciate your time. I hope that you will think over what you have seen today and that you will take some action on it. On behalf of Fund Our Communities, Bring the War Dollars Home, and Oregon PeaceWorks, I'm Peter Burgill. Remember, you can contact Oregon PeaceWorks at www.oregonpeaceworks.org, or you can call us at 503-585-2767, or you can email us at info@oregonpeaceworks.org. Thank you very much. Go in peace.